Hi everyone, I haven't done a video on my Barely-Vangelical series for a little bit of time. I have some ideas of other topics I want to get into, but if you haven't watched one of these yet, these videos are essentially me taking my very conservative evangelical upbringing, and naming some of the ways that I inherited ways of thinking from that upbringing, and then walking through my journey of disillusionment or deconstruction from those ideas, and then my reconstruction, or kind of what I came to on the other side of deconstruction. Another way to think about it is order, disorder, and reorder. You can think about it as life, death, resurrection. There's lots of threefold kind of patterns in different traditions that talk about this way of kind of experiencing faith and ideas and growth. But my point is, I want to just walk through, put out into the world, as it were, put out my journey of faith from a pretty conservative evangelical tradition through a deconstruction and then into something on the other side. And I am a Christian pastor as I record this, and so I came to Christian understandings of all of these different doctrines, but they look different than maybe what I inherited. And so that's what I'm doing with these videos. And in this video, I want to do something. This topic. This topic might be a little bit more specific to me and my story. I'm not sure how many people have gone through something similar, but I think it does point. One of the reasons I want to do this video is because it points to something that I think everyone can at least benefit from reflecting on, which is just really the nature of God, the doctrine of God. But my story specifically, and the topic I want to get into in this video, is my journey through open theism. Open theism. I'm going to define that as we kind of go through this. But I went on a pretty intense journey of questioning some of my doctrines that I was brought up in, and moving fully into an open theism kind of camp about thinking about God, and then moving out of that into what I believe today about the doctrine of God. And so I want to trace that journey through this video, going in that format of inheritance, tradition, to deconstruction, to reconstruction. So, all right, what I want to do first is I want to define open theism before I get into my journey. And my attempt to define open theism is this. At bottom, I think it's a theodicy. It's an attempt to reconcile the fact that suffering and evil and sin and death and brokenness have real presence and influence in the created world, and at the same time, Christians can affirm the sovereignty of a God who is good and love. And so how do you this is the age-old question, how do you reconcile a good and loving and powerful and sovereign God with a creation that is broken and marred by suffering and sin and death? And open theism is one way to resolve that tension. And for many people, it resolves it quite effectively, actually. And that is to say this, that God is genuinely open to the future. The future is genuinely open to God. Both are true. God has, in God's sovereignty, made God's own self and made creation such that the future is a genuinely open thing. The future is genuinely open. There can be real choices, real agency exercised by agents within God's creation, and God has made it such. God has made it that way. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the finer points about how the open theists kind of philosophically and metaphysically make that case. But that's open theism, is that it's theism, so it's affirming that there is a God and that God is sovereign, that God is over all things, but it's also affirming that God is open and that the creation itself is open to what could happen in the future. The future is not fully settled, although there's some nuancing of that, but I'll get into that in a minute. That's what open theism is, very broadly. And so now I want to get through my journey. So I grew up not being taught open theism. I grew up in, like I said, conservative evangelicalism that taught a very kind of default, straightforward doctrine of God, and doctrine of God's sovereignty, and doctrine of God's creation, and that God is Father, God is Creator, God is over all things, and that sovereignty was construed implicitly and explicitly, but that sovereignty was construed as though there is nothing that God does not know, which includes the future. There's nothing that is outside of God's control, which includes the future, includes your decisions. I was not raised in an explicitly Catholic, or not Catholic. I wasn't raised Catholic either, but I was not raised in an explicitly Calvinistic tradition. I was raised something that was maybe kind of found its wheelhouse a little bit more in an Arminian kind of tradition, maybe. But I think that many people around me and to some degree, even myself, I kind of defaulted to a Calvinistic construal of God, because it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to land anywhere if you really reflect on it. If you reflect on it seriously, you kind of get pushed into either the Calvinistic or maybe the open view. I didn't reflect on it that much. I just kind of had this subconscious tension that I didn't really examine too much, but I would affirm and pay lip service to the fact that, well, yeah, God's in control. God is God, which means that God knows everything, which means that God knows the future, which means God knows my decisions I'm going to make today before I make them. God knows what I'm going to do tomorrow. And I just never pushed really hard to reconcile that with the idea that I felt like I was a free agent making free decisions. But I inherited what I would call the broadly conservative, straightforward, quasi-Calvinistic, white evangelical, Reformed Protestant understanding of God's sovereignty. That's what I grew up with, and I didn't really question that. I got into, as high schoolers are wont to do, I had some friends who we like to have these discussions. I got into, amateurish philosophical debates about our free will. And I remember coming to I came to a settlement. This is still in my kind of inheritance traditional phase. I was really trying to just kind of stay within what I was raised with. And so I kind of came to a settled understanding that God knew all the possible paths my life could take. God knew for every individual agent, every individual person, God knew all the choices we could potentially make. And that somehow that existed within a sort of, this could be construed as philosophical, like middle knowledge, I guess. Somehow I was able to hold that intention with the fact that I felt like I could really navigate those choices of my own free will, but God knew all the choices I would make, or God knew all the options. It's almost like my life was, an atlas or a roadmap with all these junctures, and I could navigate those. I could exercise some choice in that, but God knew all of that, all of the possible choices I could make. That was kind of where I landed in high school through all these discussions and whatnot. Not a particularly interesting position, but it was how I made sense of things. Now, this is where my story takes a specific turn. And depending on who you are when you grew up in evangelicalism, if you grew up in evangelicalism, all those things are going to vary depending on how relevant this is going to be to your story. But for me, I graduated from high school in 2004. I went immediately into a small private Christian liberal arts undergraduate institution in Indiana called Huntington University. And the timing and the place are very relevant to my story, because at my institution was a teacher by the name of John Sanders. John Sanders, if you tracked the Open Theism debate within evangelicalism at all, you'll know the name John Sanders. He wrote a very significant book that I have on my shelf, down, I'm looking at it right now, called The God Who Risks. This book was a full-throated defense of open theism in an evangelical kind of way, with an evangelical kind of posture towards Scripture, taking Scripture extremely seriously, taking the sovereignty of God still extremely seriously, but he makes a proposal for an open theist rendering of God and God's sovereignty in that book. And that book made quite a stir. It was quite well known within Christian publishing at the time, Christian and the Evangelical Theological Society. There was a large dust-up and controversy with John Sanders being in that society because this doctrine was extremely controversial. And this all was happening kind of around the time when I enrolled at Huntington University. So my freshman year at Huntington University was actually, would turn out to be John Sanders' final year teaching there. John Sanders and William Hasker, who was another open theist, prominent philosophical writer in kind of evangelical Christianity, they both were in the philosophy department at Huntington, and they both taught in that department and everything. And anyways, John Sanders, it was his last year there. It was a very controversial event at my undergrad and in the denomination of the church I was part of, because he essentially got ousted, and there was a large outcry from the student body about academic freedom because he was really beloved, and he actually did not evangelize open theism in his classes. He actually was a good academic in the sense that he would teach broad views and let students wrestle with the views. And it was a very controversial happening on campus because it was really, like in many institutions, it was the movers and shakers and the funders and the board of trustees that really made did a power play to push him out of the institution, and it was very controversial and caused quite a stir. This was my freshman year at that university, and to my great regret, I did not take the chance to take a class with John Sanders that year. I wish I would have. There were banners all around campus saying, "This is your last chance to take a class with Dr. Sanders," and man, I wish I would have. I still regret that. But that being said, that was my exposure to the topic of open theism. That was my exposure to the whole idea. I didn't know anything about it going into the university, but Dr. Sanders gave a talk. He was nominated by the seniors, the graduating seniors that year, to give the final chapel talk, and he gave a very moving talk that I still remember to this day that had nothing to do with open theism, but the character he described, he put out there, the ways he challenged us as students and Christians going into the world to wrestle with our questions was very moving and effective to me, and I still remember it to this day. And that experience shifted me to be open to exploring what was he teaching that was so controversial. Okay, so that was a long way of me saying that's how I got exposed to open theism. And so I read The God Who Risks. I also sometime that year found Greg Boyd for the first time, and I read God of the Possible. I would eventually find Clark Pinnock, and I would read A Wideness in God's Mercy. I also started reading William Hasker because he was also at Huntington, and I believe, I should have looked at the title. Triumph of God Over Evil, I believe, was one of his texts. So I started swimming deep in the open theism waters, so to speak. I found, especially God of the Possible and especially The God Who Risks. I still think The God Who Risks is one of the best explications of open theism, and I found them very compelling, very, very compelling. And so reading all those texts started to, and this is going to move me into my deconstruction with what I had inherited kind of phase. I realized upon reading those texts that I had not reflected deeply on this doctrine or this idea of God's foreknowledge on our agency and our decision-making and free will and suffering and theodicy and all. I just hadn't reflected deeply on it before, and those books kicked open a lot of reflection on my part. And here's basically what I found. If I could summarize, here's what I found most compelling and persuasive about open theism. First, biblically, exegetically, the best versions of it take the biblical narrative and the biblical text very, very, very seriously. And this was something that convinced me, is I actually felt that Greg Boyd and Sanders in particular, they did a better job at explaining the biblical narrative than what I had inherited before reading them. They talk about God's texts that talk about God changing his mind, even God repenting. They talk about Jesus's surprise and the way Jesus learned things in his earthly ministry. And they draw a very compelling, seamless portrait of God portrayed through the Hebrew Scriptures and then also incarnated in Christ in the New Testament as a God who is presented as being genuinely open to human impact, to human decisions, to human prayers, to future events. And that kind of blew me away. That kind of rocked my world a little bit because it seems it's very compelling in the presentation within open theism. So I think that's one thing in its favor, is the biblical case for it is very strong, actually, much stronger than and my experience personally was that I felt like it had been hidden from me out of nerves or anxiety or something, and that's never a good feeling when you feel like something's been hidden from you and you actually found it quite compelling. So that was part of my experience, was their handling of the biblical text was very helpful and interesting. Secondly, more philosophically or metaphysically, they do some really interesting moves. Greg Boyd is particularly big on this, but they make some really interesting moves that I had never considered before. And one of them is to say that Greg Boyd will say, for example, God knows all things. He does not let go of God's omniscience. God still knows all things. He would say the future is just not a thing that can be known. It's not a thing. It's not in reality. It's not a matter of there's a thing in reality that God doesn't know. It's a matter of what is the reality that God knows everything of. And Boyd would say the future is just not part of that. And so therefore we being open theists can fully and full-throatedly affirm God's full knowledge and omniscience. It's just that the future is not a thing that's included in that. And that, as a metaphysical move, as a kind of a metaphysical definition of reality, that kind of caught me up short, and I thought that's really interesting, and I kind of don't feel like I have a rebuttal to that. That's really interesting. And so the combination of the treatment of the biblical text and the biblical narrative and the serious whether or not you agree with that, and I actually don't agree with what I just said a minute ago. Now I'll get to that in a minute. I don't agree with that construal of reality. So wherever you land on that, at least what they were modeling to me was serious metaphysical and philosophical reflection, and they were able to respond to what I saw as the critiques very well. Boyd would also say that he does not, and Sanders would say this too, he does not lapse into a full kind of open dualistic, like, will God win in the end or not? He would say that God's sovereignty in an overarching sense, that God will accomplish what God has set out to accomplish, is that, but between here and there, he is a created creation as such that humans can have real impact on how that unfolds. That's how I think he would construe it, to be as fair as possible to him. But a la John Sanders, this is the third thing I'm going to say is compelling about open theism, is that it portrays a God who genuinely risks and can then genuinely experience the pain and suffering that we experience in creation as humans. And that contextualizes the role of prayer in a different way than I had ever thought of before. And so that's something else that Boyd especially is really big on, is that prayer is like a really important thing for Christians to engage in because the future is open. And that, to me, spoke in an encouraging and pastoral way against the overly rigid, dry, Calvinistic, the future's all settled kind of, so what's the point, which is an extremely lazy, simplistic rendering of that. But it still spoke a different word to the function of prayer, or the function of spiritual maturity and discipleship and growth and all that stuff, formation. So biblically, philosophically, and then from a discipleship spiritual formation kind of angle, open theism proposed something that was compelling to me on all of those fronts, made a lot of sense to me. I could still take scripture very seriously, which I wanted to do. I could still take the omniscience of God very seriously. And suddenly prayer had a different kind of valence to it than it had in my past, in my growing up. And so that convinced me. All those things together convinced me of open theism, and I deconstructed my kind of prior shallow understanding of God's sovereignty and God's control over all things, and I had a much more robust sense of human agency in the world and in creation moving forward. And so that moved me into the open theism camp, and I would defend open theism. I have a lot of stories of being in pastors' conferences or pastors' meetings and hedging as to whether or not I could talk about. I remember one particular conference I went to where I mentioned Greg Boyd, not even an open theism reference. I mentioned his book Letters from a Skeptic, which I think is still a wonderful book. I mentioned that as a good apologetic resource in this pastor's conference. And in the bathroom, I was confronted by another pastor in the room about whether or not I was an open theist because I mentioned Greg Boyd. So that was quite an experience. And I could list off other experiences like that, where I learned very quickly that to mention Greg Boyd, when this argument was raging in 2000s into the 2010s, when that was happening, mentioning someone like Greg Boyd or Clark Pinnock would get you nailed pretty fast. So I learned that pretty quickly, but I would still defend, if I had space and time, I would give more of what I considered a thoughtful defense of open theism and why I found it compelling. And in some of my student ministry work, I can think of one student in particular who was plagued by the issue of theodicy, of like, why do bad things happen? And I remember going to an open theistic rendering of that question to give that student some encouragement. And for what it's worth, in that particular conversation, the student was actually encouraged to know that there was at least another option, another way of thinking about this. And so yeah, I was definitely in the open theism kind of way of being for years, I would say. I graduated from undergrad in 2008, and I was an open theist for, I would say, at least 8 years after my graduation, finished undergrad. So then the question becomes, okay, why am I not an open theist today? And I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm an open theist today. And so that's the next stage of my journey, which is how did I guess this is like the second deconstruction. How did I get disillusioned with open theism and come into something new? But I would put this as more of my reconstruction, because I've come back to something that is more reminiscent of my upbringing, which is more of I would say, a more robust affirmation of God's sovereignty and God's actual full knowledge, actual omniscience. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that pushed me in that direction. And if I could summarize it in my life, it would be a recovering of a classical understanding of God, classical doctrine of God. The writer that's probably played the most significant role in this for me, undeniably, is David Bentley Hart. I know he's controversial for his stances on universalism and some of his writing style, but I mean, set that aside if that's an issue for you. David Bentley Hart's rendering of the doctrine of God, particularly in a book like The Beauty of the Infinite or The Experience of God, is just unlike anything else I've read. It's unparalleled in his writing ability, in his evocative way of bringing out the mysteries of God, more getting at more of an apophatic kind of tradition, which is more prominent in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is where David Bentley Hart is. And so he played a significant role in that for me. But what I started to wrestle with through his writings, and then there's other examples. Like there's an obscure book called Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of God is another book that really stuck with me. Also, J.D. Lionheart's slim, actually very funny book, but very serious philosophical book, Monotheism, is another one that stuck with me. Recovering, so like Philip Carey, who is a very strong Lutheran, he has a book called The Meaning of Protestant Theology that has some interesting discussions of the doctrine of God. And there's more I can mention, but those were some that I started to come to these resources, and particularly David Bentley Hart challenged and confronted the idea of a theistic personalism by way of pointing readers more towards a deeper classical understanding of God, a recovery of the classical understanding of God. And something that the Open Theism camp, at least at the time when I was in it, something the Open Theism camp kind of trumpets a lot is pitting Hebraic and Greek ways of thinking against each other. And that to me, Drew Johnson's another good scholar on recovering more of a Hebraic full sense of Hebraic thinking, Hebraic philosophy. But something the Open Theism camp will do is they'll pit a Hebraic way of thinking versus a Greek way of thinking, and the argument will be, I've heard Greg Boyd explicitly say this, the argument will be that there was this Hebraic way of thinking which had more of an earthy God, more of a suffering God, more of a God in time, way of understanding the doctrine of God, and then the Greek Platonic view is much more of the idealistic, abstracted, disembodied, eternal, timeless, impassible God, and that sometimes the open theist argument will be basically that Christians let the Greek Platonic God infiltrate the Hebraic ideas and kind of take over, and that we actually are more Platonic in our doctrines of God than Hebraic. And I kind of bought that argument for a while, but people like Dave Bentley Hart and others who frankly are much more well-versed in actual philosophical texts from the ancient sources really demolished that argument. And the idea that the Hebraic view of God was so, personal theism really is what it is. The idea that that's what the Hebraic or the Hebrews thought of God is just not responsible kind of scholarship or not responsible reading of actual Hebrew ancient doctrine. I came to understand. And so that argument started to really lose a lot of purchase with me. And then more broadly, I started to come around to this realization, and what I would say, and this is what I would say now, is that the open theist God is a God within creation. The open theist God is more akin to a Zeus or Odin or a God that is a personality within the creation that God made. And when I started to realize that, as opposed to the more classical rendering of God, which is God is being as such. God is not a being, but God is being itself. All things are live and move and have their being in God. Like God is, and then that starts to open the door to re-understanding why something like divine simplicity is actually a very important doctrine, or why creation ex nihilo is a very important doctrine, why immutability is actually a very important doctrine. And the book Kierkegaard and the Changelessness of God that I just mentioned makes an existential case for why the stability of divine immutability is radically important. And for me, when I started to reflect on the personalist theism kind of challenge from David Bentley Hart and others, and I started to reflect on the implications of what it might mean that God could be mutable and then therefore God could change, when you really reflect on those implications, it starts to get staggering. The idea that God on some fundamental level is open to change is beyond existentially frightening and overwhelming. The God who created all things could decide, could change, and decide creation was a mistake. Could decide that maybe all people do deserve damnation, for example. And yes, there are biblical texts that seem to indicate that God repents and God changes his mind. That's I don't have time to necessarily go into that in this video, but I started to reflect. So deep philosophy and metaphysical reflection got me to this place where I realized there were massive, massive, massive problems with the idea of a God who could change and who God who was open to the future, did not know the future. And pair that with a recovery and a realization that the ancient Hebrew doctrine knew that. Ancient Hebrew doctrine knew that, and that's why Jewish monotheism is so strict and rigid and careful in its construal of what it means for God to be one and God to be creator. Oh, Peter Leithart's another really good one on this, who challenges... Peter Leithart challenges both the process and open theist side, but also challenges nuances the classical side of things in a really helpful way. So I recommend his work on the book in his book Creator. So these things started to disillusion me, started to trouble me, and importantly, so I got troubled with some of the implications of the open theism God being a God within creation that's bound up in creation in a way that started to be quite unsettling. Combine that with the fact, and this is where Hart's book, The Experience of God, is masterful in my view, is actually finding the classical doctrine of God compelling again, beautiful again. So the idea of God being simple, not made of parts, God being immutable, not able to change in terms of God's disposition and God's character and God's love, not being able to change in God's posture towards the creation that God made freely. That portrayal of God, that understanding of God, which is much more quote-unquote classical, I would argue also deeply historically Jewish and Hebraic, that understanding of God is powerfully compelling and beautiful. And I found myself drawn back to that. So for a time I was drawn to the ways open theism settles some tensions, but then I found a much deeper and I would argue truer understanding of who God is in this recovery of this classical view and all the implications that flow out of that. And I found that much more compelling, much more, dare I say, just comforting. The idea of creation itself being a gracious act of a loving God that exists in Trinity forever. I mean, the beauty of the infinite is unparalleled in its ability to explicate some of these things in a beautiful way. That's David Bentley Hart again. So coming back to all those things really soured me on where I had found myself comfortable with open theism for some years. And so I would say my full kind of culmination of my journey thus far is I am a classical theist. I'm much more in the classical theist camp that is not a, divine personalism. I do believe, obviously, in the incarnation of Christ in a specific time in history, and I believe in that as a kind of an apocalyptic revealing that God, the simple, divine, immutable, fully omniscient, which includes the future. I can't go with the open theism, bracketing off the future as something that God could know within reality. I think that the future, and this is where monotheism is so good. J.D. Linehart's book, he very humorously and winsomely makes the case that eternity is of a different... eternity is just not the biggest number. Eternity is a different kind of thing, and so God is eternal. And then all the other things that are bound up in that, immutable, simple, unchangeable, all of that. And so the eternal God, the idea that the eternal God has bracketed off the future as something that God can know, that is just philosophical ludicrousness. It actually breaks down profoundly upon actual serious, stringent metaphysical and philosophical reflection. So that really lost any traction with me as well, to start to approximately understand God as eternal. And so all these things combine together, and I've moved into a much more, I would say, robustly Hebraic/classical understanding of who God is. God the Father, God the Creator, God, the Trinity, the Trinitarian God of all things is immutable, simple, divine, transcendent, all of these things. And so that God cannot be a God within creation as what I would argue the open theist God kind of needs to be. As much as the open theism, rendering makes some sense of some difficult scriptural challenges, and as much as it makes some sense of suffering in the world, or at least it tries to, it just breaks down when you get when you get much deeper in reflecting on who God is and why these renderings of God have really stood the test of time when it comes to classical doctrines. And so, yeah, I affirm all those things about God, all those traits about God, all the omnis, omnipotent, omniscient, all of that. But most importantly, I affirm God as Trinity and God as love. And that for me that for me is the distinction between the Platonic Greek, fully abstract God and the Hebraic God. I think that all those classical doctrines belong, but the definition of God as Trinity and God as love is what sets it apart, and that's where I find myself today. I find myself totally affirming against the open theist view all of those doctrines of God, with the understanding that God is Trinity and that God incarnated fully in the God-man, Christ, at a certain stage in creation history. And then there's a bajillion implications that flow out of that, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just tracing my journey through this kind of specific doctrine of God and how I got to where I am today. So I'm going to wrap this video there. Again, I don't know how much this particular aspect of my journey is going to resonate with you watching this, but if you're someone who's been intrigued by the open theism camp, or maybe you had no idea what the whole dust-up was, if you're in evangelicalism, or if you found yourself disillusioned with certain ways of talking about God, I don't know. I hope something in my journey, I hope something in my story, and some of the resources I highlight and talk about, I hope something there can resonate with you and might be something that would help you continue to process all of this stuff. But if you resonate with this, if you've had similar journeys, if this brings up questions or thoughts for you, please post. Please let others know as you're watching this, because I think there's a lot of other people who have similar journeys that they've walked in and out of different evangelical kind of doctrines over their life. So I'll stop myself there. But as always, thank you for taking some time to watch.